I arrived at my granddaughter's wedding earlier than most people. Not because I wanted attention. Not because I thought anyone would notice. Old habits are hard to break. When you spend most of your life hosting family gatherings, you learn that arriving early simply feels right. You make sure everything is in order. You check if anyone needs help. You quietly fill the empty spaces before the noise begins. The venue was a renovated vineyard just outside Sacramento. The kind of place with long wooden tables, soft white lights hanging from trees, and a view of rolling hills that stretched farther than my eyes could comfortably follow. I had driven nearly 90 miles that morning, taking the slow country roads instead of the highway. At my age, rushing rarely leads to anything good. The gravel crunched beneath my shoes as I stepped out of the car. For a moment, I just stood there. Weddings always carry a certain kind of air. Anticipation mixed with nerves. The scent of flowers. The quiet movement of staff arranging chairs and linens as if they were setting the stage for something sacred. I smoothed the front of my navy blue dress. It wasn't new, but it was elegant enough. My late husband used to say navy made me look dignified, though I suspect he mostly said that because it was his favorite color. I carried a small silver clutch and a thin envelope inside it. Just a gift. Nothing more. At least, that was what everyone assumed. Inside the entrance tent, a young woman with a clipboard looked up and gave me the polite smile reserved for guests who arrive before the crowd. "Good afternoon," she said. "Name?" "Margaret Holloway," I replied. She ran her finger down the list, paused for a second, then nodded. "Oh, yes. Here you are." She reached into a small wooden box and pulled out a name tag attached to a delicate ribbon. It looked like the kind meant to be worn around the neck, something decorative that matched the rustic theme of the wedding. I noticed the hesitation before she handed it to me. Just a flicker. Most people wouldn't have seen it. But when you live 71 years, you become very good at noticing small things. "Enjoy the ceremony," she said quickly. I thanked her and stepped aside. The tag swung lightly between my fingers as I looked down at it. For a moment, I thought I had misread it. Then I looked again. Printed neatly in elegant black script were the words, "The absent old lady." I blinked. Once. Twice. Around me, a few early guests had begun to gather near the welcome table. 2 women holding champagne flutes glanced in my direction. One of them noticed the tag in my hand. Her lips pressed together, the way people do when they're trying not to react too openly. The other leaned closer to her. A quiet whisper. Then a soft laugh that was quickly disguised as a cough. I didn't say anything. Instead, I turned the tag slightly so the sunlight hit it. The ink was crisp. The card thick and expensive. This wasn't a printing mistake from a cheap office machine. Someone had ordered these intentionally. Dozens of them probably. Customized. Planned. I let out a slow breath and looked toward the reception area. Staff were finishing the table arrangements across the lawn. A white arch covered in roses stood at the far end where the ceremony would take place in another hour. Somewhere inside the bridal suite, my granddaughter Emily was getting ready. I remembered the day she was born. 30 years ago, in a small hospital room that smelled faintly of antiseptic and warm blankets. My son had been pacing the hallway, nervous as a teenage boy waiting outside the principal's office. When the nurse finally placed that tiny bundle in my arms, Emily opened her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Just long enough to stare directly at me. Her mother used to joke that Emily had always been observant. Even as a baby. I wondered what she would think if she saw this tag. Or maybe she already had. I slipped the ribbon over my head and let the card rest against the front of my dress. If someone had gone through the effort of preparing it, it seemed almost rude not to wear it. The lawn began to fill slowly as more guests arrived. Men in tailored suits. Women in pastel dresses. The kind of crowd that looked comfortable in expensive places. I recognized a few faces from family gatherings over the years, though many of them avoided meeting my eyes. Funny how that happens. People don't like standing too close to awkward situations, even when they didn't create them. A waiter passed by carrying a tray of champagne glasses. "Would you like one, ma'am?" he asked. I took a glass and thanked him. The bubbles rose lazily to the surface as I walked toward the seating chart displayed near the reception area. A large board listed every guest and their assigned table. My name appeared near the bottom. Table 17. I followed the numbers across the lawn until I found it. The table sat near the far edge of the property, close to the small parking area and well outside the soft glow of the main string lights. Not quite hidden, but certainly distant from the center of the celebration. 6 empty chairs surrounded it. No place cards yet. Just a small vase with 3 white roses. I set my clutch down and took a seat. From here, the ceremony arch looked smaller somehow. Almost like a picture frame placed too far away. Across the lawn, laughter drifted through the air as guests greeted one another. Cameras flashed. Music played softly through hidden speakers. A perfect wedding scene. Except for the quiet little corner where I sat. A few people walked past my table on their way to the bar. Most of them glanced briefly at the name tag around my neck. Some frowned. Some looked away quickly. And one man, an older gentleman I vaguely remembered from my son's business circle, actually stopped. He read the tag. Then looked at me. His expression shifted from confusion to something closer to sympathy. "I'm sure there's been some sort of mistake," he said gently. I smiled. "No," I replied. "I don't think there has." He hesitated, as though considering whether to say more, then gave a small nod and continued walking. The sun dipped slightly lower, casting long shadows across the grass. I checked my watch. 45 minutes until the ceremony. Plenty of time. Enough time to observe. Enough time to remember. And enough time to decide exactly how the rest of this evening would unfold. I took a slow sip of champagne and let my eyes drift back toward the bridal suite. Somewhere behind those closed doors were the people who believed this small piece of paper would define my place in their celebration. The absent old lady. The phrase sat quietly against my chest, moving slightly each time the breeze crossed the lawn. I didn't remove it. Not yet. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let people believe their little performance is working. At least for a while. The lawn grew busier as the afternoon moved forward. More cars rolled into the gravel lot. More laughter drifted across the vineyard. The quiet space around table 17 remained untouched, like an island no one quite wanted to visit. I didn't mind. In fact, the distance gave me a clearer view of everything. A wedding reveals a lot about a family. Not just the vows or the decorations, but the small movements people make when they think no one important is watching. Across the lawn, my daughter-in-law Caroline appeared near the reception tent. Even from 50 yards away, she was easy to recognize. Caroline had a way of carrying herself that made people turn their heads. Perfect posture. Perfect hair. A pale champagne-colored dress that probably cost more than the first car I ever owned. She was speaking with the event coordinator, pointing toward the tables, occasionally glancing down at a clipboard. Always organizing. Always controlling. Caroline had been that way since the day my son introduced her to the family 15 years ago. Back then, she had a softer voice. A gentler smile. But the eyes were the same. Careful. Calculating. She laughed at something the coordinator said, then her gaze swept across the lawn. For a brief moment, our eyes met. She noticed the tag around my neck. Her expression froze. Just for half a second. Then she looked away, continuing her conversation as if nothing had happened. I took another sip of champagne. That tiny reaction told me everything I needed to know. This hadn't been a mistake at the check-in table. This had been planned. The music shifted to a light string quartet melody as guests began moving toward their assigned seats for the ceremony. Chairs lined the aisle in perfect rows beneath the white rose arch. Couples walked arm in arm. Friends took photos with their phones. Someone's child ran through the grass before being gently called back by their parents. I stayed where I was. From table 17, the ceremony area looked peaceful. Almost like a painting. A young woman in a lavender dress approached my table, scanning the seating chart in her hands. She glanced at me, then at the tag around my neck. Her brow creased slightly. "Are you waiting for someone?" she asked politely. "No," I said. "This is my table." She looked around at the empty chairs. "Oh," she replied softly. "I thought maybe there had been a mix-up." "No mix-up," I said again. She nodded, still unsure, then continued toward another table where a group of guests waved her over. The sun had lowered enough that the vineyard hills were turning golden. Shadows stretched across the lawn, and the string lights above the reception area flickered on one by one. Beautiful timing. Weddings always aim for that perfect golden hour moment. I rested my hands on the table and looked again at the words hanging from my neck. The absent old lady. It was a clever insult, really. Subtle enough to pass as humor. Sharp enough to sting. Most people would have taken it off by now. Or left quietly. But I didn't. Because the truth was, I hadn't come all this way just to sit in the corner and disappear. Not today. And certainly not at my own granddaughter's wedding. Guests continued taking their seats as the music softened. From where I sat at table 17, the ceremony looked almost distant, like watching a play from the back row of a theater. The white chairs filled slowly. Gentle conversations floated through the air. Glasses clinked softly somewhere near the bar. No one approached my table. That, too, was interesting. Because at most weddings, people wander. They greet relatives they haven't seen in years. They introduce spouses, children, new friends. Someone always ends up sitting in the wrong place, laughing about it later. But not here. People glanced toward my corner of the lawn, and then kept walking. It was subtle. Polite. Almost invisible. But it was deliberate. I folded my hands in front of me and watched the guests settle in. A warm breeze moved through the vineyard, carrying the scent of roses and freshly cut grass. Somewhere behind the ceremony arch, a photographer adjusted his camera lens. And then I saw my son. Daniel stepped out from the side of the reception tent, straightening the sleeves of his dark suit. He looked older than the last time I had seen him. The kind of older that doesn't come from birthdays, but from quiet compromises made over time. He paused near the aisle, scanning the crowd. For a moment, his eyes landed on me. Then they dropped. He adjusted his tie and turned to speak with one of the groomsmen. I didn't call out to him. I didn't wave. Daniel had always avoided difficult conversations. Even as a boy, he would disappear into his room when tension filled the house. Some habits follow us well into adulthood. Still, seeing him look away told me something important. He had noticed the tag. Which meant he also understood exactly what it meant. The officiant took his place beneath the arch, signaling that the ceremony would begin soon. Guests straightened in their seats. Phones were silenced. The quiet excitement of the moment settled over the lawn. From the bridal suite across the property, the doors finally opened. Emily stepped out onto the path, her white dress catching the last golden light of the afternoon. For a second, the entire gathering seemed to pause. She looked beautiful. Calm. A small smile resting on her face as she walked beside her father. I felt a familiar warmth in my chest watching her. No matter how complicated families become, certain memories never really fade. I remembered teaching Emily how to ride a bicycle when she was 7 years old. She had fallen twice on the driveway and stood up both times without crying. Again, she had said, brushing the dust from her knees. Stubborn. Determined. Just like her grandfather. Now she moved slowly down the aisle while guests stood to watch. Cameras lifted. The music swelled gently. From my distant table, I could see Caroline watching proudly from the front row. Perfect posture again. Perfect smile. Every detail of this wedding had been arranged under her supervision. Every ribbon. Every table. Every name tag. The card against my chest shifted slightly as the breeze passed through again. The absent old lady. I traced the edge of it with my fingers, thoughtful. Because the strange thing was, I hadn't actually been absent. Not really. I had been there for most of Emily's childhood. Birthdays. School recitals. Summer afternoons in the old backyard pool. But somewhere over the last 10 years, the invitations had grown fewer. Then quieter. Until eventually, they stopped. The officiant began speaking, welcoming everyone to the ceremony. Applause followed. Emily and her fiancé joined hands beneath the arch. And as the vows began, I realized something quietly ironic. They had given me a name tag that said I didn't belong here. But the truth was, I might have been the only person at this wedding who truly understood how this family had become what it was today. The ceremony ended just as the sun slipped behind the hills. Applause rose gently across the lawn as Emily and her husband shared their first kiss as a married couple. Cameras flashed. Guests stood and cheered. Someone nearby wiped away a happy tear. From table 17, I joined the applause. It felt polite. Necessary. Emily deserved a beautiful moment, even if the rest of the day had been arranged in ways she might not fully understand yet. After the ceremony, people began drifting toward the reception area where long tables waited beneath rows of glowing lights. Music picked up again, a light jazz tune this time, and servers appeared carrying trays of appetizers. The evening portion of the wedding had begun. Guests walked past my table on their way to the bar or the dance floor. The crowd was relaxed now, voices louder, laughter easier. Weddings always have that turning point, when the formal part ends and people begin behaving like themselves again. I noticed something interesting during those first 20 minutes. Every single guest had a name tag. Not the simple kind you write by hand at a conference. These were printed cards, matching the rustic design of the decorations, hanging from thin satin ribbons. Each one carried a short title beneath the guest's name. I watched a young couple pass by. College friends, their tags read. Another group followed behind them. Daniel's business partners. A pair of older women stopped near the dessert table. Bride's aunts. The theme was clear. The tags were meant to be playful. A way of identifying how each person fit into Emily and her husband's lives. Guests seemed amused by it. Some even laughed as they compared titles. Look, one man said to his wife, they labeled us golf buddies. She smiled. At least they didn't call us retirement club. More laughter. I sat quietly and listened. Because slowly, a pattern began to settle in my mind. Every tag explained a relationship. Every tag described a place in the couple's story. Except mine. Mine didn't say grandmother. It didn't say family. It didn't say guest. Instead, the card against my chest told a completely different story. The absent old lady. Not a role. Not a relationship. A judgment. Across the reception lawn, Caroline was moving from table to table, greeting guests with the polished confidence of someone hosting a charity gala. When she reached the bar area, two women pointed discreetly in my direction. Caroline followed their gaze. Her eyes landed on me again. This time, she didn't look away immediately. She studied the tag around my neck, then gave a small smile. The kind people use when they believe a message has been received. I returned the smile. Calm. Pleasant. Because Caroline had always believed something about me that wasn't entirely true. She believed that silence meant weakness. That politeness meant surrender. That older people eventually grow tired of fighting for their place in a room. Perhaps in some cases, that might be correct. But Caroline had only known me during the quiet years of my life. After my husband passed. After I stepped away from the company we built together. After I stopped attending certain family gatherings that had slowly become uncomfortable. She had never known the version of me who negotiated business contracts across 3 states. The woman who once sat at boardroom tables filled with men twice as loud and twice as certain of themselves. The woman who had learned very early that patience can be far more powerful than noise. I finished the last sip of champagne in my glass and set it carefully on the table. The evening air was cooling now. Music floated across the lawn while servers lit small candles along the center of each table. A waiter passed by and asked if I needed anything. Not yet, I said. Because the truth was, I was waiting. Not for an apology. Not for an explanation. Just for the right moment. And weddings, like most carefully planned events, always provide one eventually. The reception settled into its rhythm as twilight spread across the vineyard. String lights glowed warmly above the tables, casting soft circles of light across white tablecloths and polished glassware. The band had switched to a gentle swing tune, and somewhere near the dance floor, a group of younger guests had already begun laughing louder than the music. From table 17, the view was peaceful. Almost too peaceful. Servers moved gracefully between tables, placing salads in front of guests. Plates clinked softly. Someone raised a toast near the center table, and a ripple of applause followed. No one came to my corner. Not my son. Not Caroline. Not even Emily. I watched them all from a distance. Daniel sat at the head table beside Caroline and the newly married couple. His shoulders were slightly tense, his smile polite but restrained. Every so often he adjusted his cuff or glanced toward the bar. The same small nervous habits he had carried since he was young. Emily looked radiant, leaning close to her husband as they spoke quietly with friends seated nearby. She laughed at something someone said, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. For a moment, she looked exactly like the little girl who used to sit at my kitchen counter eating chocolate chip cookies. Life has a way of layering memories like that. Past and present sitting side by side. A waiter eventually approached my table with a tray. "Dinner will be served shortly, ma'am," he said kindly. "Would you like some water or wine?" "Water would be lovely," I replied. He placed the glass in front of me, hesitating just slightly as his eyes drifted to the card around my neck. People rarely know how to react to something that feels wrong but isn't their place to question. "Thank you," he said quietly before moving on. I looked down at the place settings around me. 6 plates. 6 folded napkins. 6 chairs. All empty. The arrangement had clearly been intentional. Whoever designed the seating chart had made sure my table would remain comfortably isolated. Far enough from the head table. Far enough from family. Close enough to still be visible. It was a clever balance. Across the lawn, Caroline stood to greet another group of guests who had just arrived late to the reception. Her smile was wide and welcoming as she guided them toward their seats. When she finished, she turned slightly, and once again her eyes landed on me. The smile faded just enough to become something else. A quiet satisfaction. As if she believed the evening was unfolding exactly as planned. I raised my glass of water in her direction. A small gesture. Almost like a toast. Her expression tightened for just a moment before she looked away again. Interesting. I placed the glass back on the table and reached for my clutch. The silver clasp opened with a soft click. Inside, the envelope rested exactly where I had left it that morning. Cream-colored. Unsealed. I slid it halfway out and ran my fingers along its edge. Some guests believe wedding gifts are meant to celebrate the future. Sometimes they are. But occasionally, a gift can also remind people of the past. Of promises made long before the music and decorations. Of agreements that shaped the very foundation of a family. I returned the envelope to the clutch and closed it again. Across the reception, the band leader tapped the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced warmly, "in just a few minutes we'll begin the evening toasts." Guests turned their attention toward the head table. Glasses were filled again. Chairs shifted closer. Anticipation spread through the crowd. Speeches are always an important part of weddings. People share memories. Offer blessings. Tell stories that make the room laugh or grow quiet. But sometimes, a speech reveals far more than anyone expected. And tonight, sitting quietly at table 17 with a name tag that declared me the absent old lady, I had a feeling this wedding might be remembered for a very long time. The band leader stepped away from the microphone, and the soft hum of conversation returned for a moment. Then Daniel stood. My son adjusted the front of his suit jacket as he walked toward the microphone stand near the head table. The crowd quieted almost instantly. A few guests lifted their glasses in anticipation. The father of the bride usually speaks first. Daniel cleared his throat lightly and smiled at the room. "Good evening, everyone," he began. His voice carried easily through the speakers. Calm. Polite. The same voice he used at business conferences and holiday dinners. "Thank you all for being here to celebrate Emily and Jason today." Applause rippled through the crowd. I watched him carefully. Daniel had always been good with prepared words. When he knew what he wanted to say, he could deliver it smoothly, almost effortlessly. He spoke about Emily's childhood. About the first time she learned to ride a bike. About how she used to line up her stuffed animals on the living room couch and pretend to host tea parties. Guests laughed softly at the image. Emily covered her mouth with her hand, smiling as she listened. For a few minutes, everything felt exactly the way a wedding speech should feel. Warm. Comfortable. Safe. Then Daniel shifted slightly, glancing toward Caroline. "And of course," he continued, "none of this would have been possible without my wonderful wife, Caroline." Caroline gave a graceful nod from her seat beside him. "She planned this entire event from start to finish," Daniel said proudly. "Every detail you see tonight, every table, every flower, every little personal touch, was her idea." Another round of applause filled the reception area. I noticed Caroline's eyes scanning the room as the guests clapped. Her gaze passed across several tables. Then it reached table 17. For a brief second, our eyes met again. She smiled. Not warmly, but with the quiet confidence of someone who believed her message had landed exactly where she intended. Daniel continued speaking, telling a few more stories about Emily and welcoming Jason into the family. It was all very proper. Very polished. When he finished, the guests applauded again as he stepped away from the microphone. The band leader returned briefly. "Thank you, Daniel," he said cheerfully. "Next we'll hear from the maid of honor." Emily's best friend stood and walked toward the microphone, her lavender dress catching the glow of the string lights. While the crowd shifted their attention toward her speech, I noticed something happening near the head table. Caroline leaned toward Daniel. She whispered something in his ear. Daniel nodded slowly, then glanced in my direction. This time he didn't look away immediately. His eyes moved from my face, to the card resting against my chest. Then to the small table where I sat alone. His expression tightened slightly. Not anger. Not embarrassment. Something closer to unease. Caroline followed his gaze again, her smile fading for just a moment as she noticed the direction of his attention. She spoke to him again, quieter this time. Daniel nodded once more. Then he reached for his glass and took a long drink. Across the lawn, the maid of honor began telling a story about Emily from their college years, and the guests laughed warmly. But at the head table, something small had shifted. Caroline had expected many reactions tonight. Embarrassment. Silence. Maybe even that I would quietly leave before dinner. But one reaction she hadn't planned for was patience. I sat calmly at table 17, hands folded beside my clutch. Listening. Waiting. Because sometimes the most important moments at a wedding don't happen during the ceremony. They happen during the speeches. And the night was only just beginning. The maid of honor finished her speech to warm applause. Glasses lifted around the tables. Laughter lingered in the air. The band played a soft transition while another speaker prepared to step forward. From my seat at table 17, I watched the head table carefully. Emily leaned toward her husband, whispering something that made him smile. Daniel sat beside them, nodding politely as a few relatives spoke with him between speeches. But Caroline was different. She wasn't watching the speakers. She was watching me. Not constantly. Not in a way that would draw attention. But every few minutes her eyes drifted across the lawn, checking my corner like someone glancing at a clock. Measuring time. Measuring reactions. It made sense, really. When someone sets a small trap, they usually expect one of two outcomes. The person either reacts loudly or disappears quietly. Neither had happened. I was still there. Still wearing the tag. Still sitting calmly at the most isolated table in the vineyard. Eventually another toast ended, and the guests applauded again. During the brief pause before the next speaker, a young man approached my table carrying a glass of wine. He looked to be in his late 20s. Tall, polite, a little uncertain. "Excuse me," he said gently. "Yes?" I replied. "I'm Jason's cousin," he explained, gesturing toward the groom's side of the reception. "I just wanted to say. I think someone messed up your name tag." He nodded toward the ribbon around my neck. I looked down at it briefly. "Do you?" I asked. "Well, yeah," he said with a nervous laugh. "I mean, everyone else has titles like bride's aunt or college friends. That one seems strange." Strange. That was a generous word for it. "What's your name?" I asked him. "Ethan." "Well, Ethan," I said calmly, "sometimes the strange details at events like this tell you more than the decorations." He frowned slightly, trying to understand. "I guess so," he said. He hesitated another moment, then lowered his voice. "For what it's worth. I don't think it's very funny." I smiled. "That makes two of us." He nodded respectfully before returning to his table. Across the lawn, the band leader stepped back to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said cheerfully, "we have time for one more toast before dinner is served." A soft murmur moved through the guests. Caroline leaned toward Daniel again. This time, she didn't whisper. She simply nodded toward the microphone. Daniel looked uncertain for a moment, then stood. My son walked slowly toward the front again, adjusting the cuff of his jacket as he approached the stand. The room quieted. A few guests assumed he might be adding a final thought. Perhaps another blessing for the newlyweds. But Daniel didn't begin speaking immediately. Instead, he looked out across the tables. His gaze moved past the dance floor, past the bar, past the rows of guests. Until it reached the far corner of the reception. Table 17. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Daniel's eyes rested on the card hanging from the ribbon around my neck. Then he looked back toward the microphone. "I'd like to invite someone else to say a few words tonight," he said slowly. A ripple of curiosity moved through the crowd. Daniel cleared his throat again. My mother is here this evening, he continued. And I realize she hasn't had a chance to speak yet. Dozens of heads turned at once. All of them searching for the same thing. The woman sitting alone beneath the string lights, wearing a name tag that read the absent old lady. For a moment, no one moved. The entire reception seemed to pause under the soft glow of the string lights. Dozens of guests followed Daniel's gaze across the lawn. Heads turned slowly. Conversations faded into silence. And just like that, every pair of eyes in the vineyard found table 17. Found me. I remained seated for another second, letting the quiet settle over the room. Then I reached for my clutch. The chair legs scraped softly against the grass as I stood. The small movement sounded louder than it should have in such a quiet moment. The ribbon around my neck swayed slightly as I stepped away from the table. The absent old lady. The words rested plainly against my navy dress as I began walking across the lawn. The distance from table 17 to the microphone wasn't far, maybe 40 yards, but in that moment it felt longer. Guests watched with open curiosity. Some whispered to one another. Others simply stared. By the time I reached the front, Daniel had stepped aside from the microphone. He looked at me carefully. "Mom," he said quietly. Just that one word. It had been a long time since I'd heard him say it like that. Not in a phone call. Not in passing. But standing face to face. I gave him a small nod and stepped toward the microphone. The band leader adjusted it slightly lower for me. "Thank you," I said. My voice carried gently through the speakers. Calm. Steady. The kind of voice that comes from years of speaking in rooms much larger than this one. "I didn't expect to speak tonight," I began. A few polite chuckles moved through the guests. "That usually happens at weddings," I continued. "People plan every detail months in advance, and then something unexpected still finds its way onto the schedule." Light laughter followed. I glanced toward Emily. She looked confused, but not upset. Just surprised. Her husband Jason sat beside her, watching carefully. "I've been sitting over there for most of the evening," I said, gesturing toward the far corner of the reception lawn. Table 17. A few guests turned slightly, as if noticing the table's location for the first time. "It's a lovely spot," I added. "Quiet. Peaceful. A good place to observe." More quiet laughter. Caroline shifted slightly in her seat. I noticed it. Then I reached up and gently lifted the name tag hanging from the ribbon around my neck. The card caught the light from the string bulbs overhead. "I was given this when I arrived," I said. A ripple moved through the crowd as people leaned forward to read the words. Even those seated far away seemed to sense the tension in the air. I held the card between my fingers for a moment. Then I read it aloud. Asterisk asterisk the absent old lady, asterisk asterisk. A low murmur spread across the reception. Some guests looked confused. Others turned toward the head table. Caroline's smile had disappeared entirely now. I placed the card back against my chest. "You see," I continued calmly, "wedding name tags are meant to explain how people are connected." I gestured toward a nearby guest. Bride's aunt. Another table. College friends. A group near the bar. Business partners. I paused briefly. "But mine," I said gently, "seems to suggest I wasn't really part of the story." Silence settled across the lawn. Not angry silence. Just the quiet weight of realization moving through the crowd. I folded my hands lightly in front of me. "And that's an interesting idea," I said. "Because the truth is, this family's story began long before tonight." My eyes moved slowly across the guests. Then finally toward Caroline. "And sometimes," I continued softly, "the people who appear absent are the ones who know the most about how everything truly began." The room had grown completely still now. Even the band members had stopped moving behind their instruments. I took a small breath. Then reached into my silver clutch and pulled out the cream-colored envelope I had brought with me that morning. The envelope rested quietly in my hand. Under the warm lights of the vineyard, it looked simple. Cream-colored. Unremarkable. The kind of envelope people use for greeting cards or wedding gifts. But the room had grown very still. Guests leaned slightly forward in their chairs. Some held their glasses midair, forgetting to take a sip. Others glanced between me and the head table, trying to understand what was unfolding. I could feel their curiosity. Weddings rarely include surprises like this. I placed the envelope gently on the small stand beside the microphone. My husband and I were married for 42 years, I said. A few guests nodded politely. Some older relatives already knew that part of the story. He passed away 7 years ago. My voice remained steady. He was a careful man. Organized. The kind of person who labeled folders and kept copies of important documents. A faint ripple of understanding moved through the older guests. I slid a finger beneath the edge of the envelope and opened it slowly. Paper rustled softly through the microphone. And one thing he believed very strongly, I continued, was that family should always be protected. I pulled a single folded document from the envelope. Across the reception lawn, Caroline's posture had gone completely rigid. Daniel watched silently beside her. I unfolded the paper. Before he passed, I said, my husband updated a few legal documents regarding the property our family has shared for many years. Now the guests were paying very close attention. The vineyard breeze moved gently through the string lights overhead, causing them to sway slightly. This includes the house Daniel grew up in, I continued, as well as the small vineyard property that sits just north of the Sacramento River. A few murmurs passed quietly between tables. The property wasn't a secret. Many people in the room had visited it before. Summer barbecues. Holiday dinners. Birthday celebrations for Emily when she was younger. I glanced toward my granddaughter. She was watching me now with full attention. Confused, perhaps. But listening. Those properties, I said calmly, have always been held in a family trust. I lifted the document slightly. And according to the terms of that trust, ownership transfers only under certain conditions. Caroline's face had gone pale beneath the reception lights. Not dramatically. Just enough that someone sitting nearby might notice. I continued speaking gently. One of those conditions, I said, is that the property must remain part of a household that includes all direct members of the family. A few guests exchanged curious glances. They were beginning to sense where this might be going. Which means, I explained, that removing someone from the family's shared life has certain consequences. Silence spread across the lawn. Not uncomfortable. Just very attentive. I folded the document again and slipped it back into the envelope. Then I looked toward Caroline. Of course, I added kindly, most families don't worry about details like that. A small pause. Because most families don't go out of their way to label one of their own relatives, the absent old lady. Several guests shifted in their seats. The message had landed. I placed the envelope calmly back inside my clutch. The good news, I said gently, turning back toward Emily, is that today is a celebration. Emily looked at me, uncertain but attentive. A celebration of new beginnings. I gave her a warm smile. And sometimes, new beginnings remind us which parts of the past are still worth protecting. The silence that followed seemed to stretch across the entire vineyard. No one spoke. No one moved. The gentle wind rustled the leaves along the fence line, and somewhere in the distance a glass clinked softly against another. But the attention of every guest remained fixed on the front of the reception lawn. On me. I rested my hands lightly on the edge of the microphone stand. Please don't misunderstand, I said calmly. I didn't bring that document tonight to cause embarrassment. My eyes moved across the crowd. A wedding should never be remembered for conflict. Several guests nodded quietly. That would defeat the entire purpose of gathering people together. I turned slightly toward Emily and Jason. You two deserve a joyful beginning, I said gently. A marriage built on respect, kindness, and honesty. Emily's expression had softened now. The confusion in her eyes was slowly being replaced by something else. Concern. Not for herself, but for the tension she could feel spreading through the room. I continued speaking, my voice steady and even. But families are complicated things, I said. A few older guests chuckled softly in agreement. Sometimes misunderstandings grow quietly over time. Small decisions. Small words. Small assumptions about who belongs and who doesn't. I reached up and lightly touched the ribbon around my neck again. The card still hung there. The absent old lady. This little tag, I said with a faint smile, is actually quite creative. A ripple of uncertain laughter moved through the guests. It tells a story, I continued. A story about someone who wasn't around. Someone who apparently stepped away from family life. I paused. But stories have two sides. My gaze moved briefly toward Daniel. My son shifted slightly in his chair. When my husband passed, I said quietly, I stepped back from many gatherings. That wasn't because I didn't care about my family. The room was completely silent again. It was because grief sometimes asks for space. I folded my hands gently in front of me. And over time, space can look a lot like absence. Several people nodded slowly. It was a feeling many of them understood. But absence, I said softly, is not the same as abandonment. My eyes drifted briefly toward Caroline. And it certainly doesn't erase the years that came before. Caroline looked down at the table for the first time that evening. I turned back toward Emily and Jason again. Tonight isn't about revisiting old misunderstandings, I said kindly. It's about reminding everyone here that family stories are longer than a single moment. I took a small step away from the microphone. And sometimes, I added gently, the people who appear quiet in the background are simply waiting for the right time to speak. A few guests began clapping softly. Not loudly. Just a respectful acknowledgement. I smiled politely. Thank you for allowing me a moment, I said. Then I reached up once more. Untied the ribbon from around my neck. And placed the name tag carefully on the microphone stand. For a few seconds, no one spoke. The name tag rested on the microphone stand beneath the soft glow of the lights, the words "the absent old lady" now visible to everyone in the front rows. The quiet clapping slowly faded. I stepped away from the microphone. The grass beneath my shoes felt cool as I began walking back across the lawn toward table 17. Guests watched in silence. Some leaned toward each other, whispering quietly. Others simply followed me with their eyes, as if unsure what would happen next. When I reached my table, I sat down calmly and folded my hands beside my clutch. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the band leader cleared his throat near the stage. Well, he said gently into the microphone, trying to lighten the mood, that might be one of the most thoughtful speeches we've heard at a wedding. A few scattered chuckles moved through the crowd. Let's give our speaker another round of applause. This time the clapping grew stronger. Not dramatic, but sincere. Across the reception, I noticed something interesting. Emily stood up from the head table. Her husband Jason looked at her with quiet curiosity as she smoothed her dress and stepped away from the group. Daniel watched her too, his expression thoughtful. Caroline remained seated. Very still. Emily walked slowly across the lawn, the soft lights reflecting in her hair as she approached my table. Guests turned their heads again, following her movement. When she reached table 17, she stopped beside me. For a moment, she simply looked down at the empty chairs surrounding the table. Then she pulled one of them out and sat. Up close, I could see the emotions moving across her face: confusion, concern, and something else that looked a lot like realization. "Grandma," she said softly. I smiled at her. "You look beautiful tonight," I replied. Her eyes flickered briefly toward the microphone stand where the name tag still hung in the distance. "I didn't know about that," she said quietly. "I believe you," I told her. Emily took a slow breath. "When I saw the seating chart earlier, I thought maybe you just preferred a quiet table," she admitted. "Caroline said you liked being away from the crowd." I nodded gently. "That does sound like something I might say." Emily looked down at the tablecloth for a moment. "I never would have let them put that on your tag," she said. "I know." She looked back at me again, searching my face. "Are you leaving?" she asked. "Not unless someone asks me to," I said with a small smile. Emily shook her head immediately. "No," she said firmly. "You're not leaving." Then she stood. Without hesitation, she reached for one of the empty chairs beside her and pulled it closer. "You're moving," she said. "Where?" I asked. She smiled for the first time since walking over. "To the head table," she said. "Where you should have been sitting all along." Across the lawn, dozens of guests watched as Emily took my hand. And for the first time that evening, Caroline finally looked uncertain about how the rest of the night would unfold. Emily's hand was warm as she gently helped me stand. For a brief moment, I hesitated, not because I doubted her, but because I could feel the attention of the entire reception turning toward us again. Weddings have a rhythm. Music. Laughter. Toasts. And sometimes, quiet turning points that no one planned. Emily didn't seem concerned about any of that. She simply held my hand and guided me across the lawn. Guests watched us as we walked together toward the head table. Some smiled softly. Others nodded in quiet approval. A few even began clapping again. Not loudly. Just enough to acknowledge what they were seeing. Family correcting itself. When we reached the head table, Jason immediately stood and pulled out a chair. "Right here," he said kindly. "Thank you," I replied. Daniel looked at me for a moment before speaking. "I should have invited you up here earlier," he said quietly. There was a hint of regret in his voice. I placed a hand gently on his arm. "Tonight isn't about mistakes," I told him softly. "It's about remembering what matters." He nodded slowly. Across the table, Caroline remained silent. Her posture was perfectly straight, her hands folded neatly beside her glass. The confident smile she had worn earlier in the evening had disappeared. She looked smaller somehow. Not defeated. Just uncertain. Emily sat beside me again and reached for her glass. "Okay," she said with a small laugh, trying to bring the room back to celebration. "I think we've officially had the most unforgettable speech of the night." Laughter spread across the tables. The tension that had filled the vineyard began to dissolve. The band leader stepped back to the microphone with a relieved smile. "Well," he said cheerfully, "now that the family has gathered where they belong, I believe dinner is ready." Servers began moving between the tables again. Music returned softly in the background. The reception continued. But something had changed. Throughout dinner, guests stopped by the head table to offer congratulations to Emily and Jason. Several of them greeted me as well, some introducing themselves, others sharing quick memories of my husband. Stories I hadn't heard in years. Moments from the past that reminded me how many lives one family can touch. Later, as the evening lights grew warmer and the first dance began, I noticed something near the microphone stand. The name tag was still there. The absent old lady. It hung quietly from the stand where I had left it. Emily noticed it too. She stood, walked across the lawn, and picked it up. For a moment she looked at the card. Then she smiled to herself and returned to the table. What are you going to do with that? Jason asked curiously. Emily turned the card over. On the blank side, she picked up a pen from the table and wrote something new. Then she placed it gently in front of me. I looked down. The old words were still faintly visible beneath the light. But across the back of the card, Emily had written something different. Family. I looked up at her. She smiled. And as the music played and the vineyard filled once again with laughter and dancing, I realized something simple but important. Sometimes people try to decide where you belong. They create labels. They tell stories about your absence. But in the end, family isn't defined by a name tag at a wedding. It's defined by the people who reach for your hand and bring you back to the table.